The polished oak and brass door of Granite National Bank closed behind Malcolm Greer with a soft, definitive click, muffling the sounds of the city street. He stood for a moment in the hushed, cool air of the lobby, a space that felt more like a cathedral to wealth than a place of business. High marble ceilings echoed the faint murmur of discreet conversations, and crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over everything. The air carried a faint scent of lemon polish and old money. Malcolm, dressed in a perfectly tailored but understated charcoal suit, scanned the room with a quiet, analytical patience. His eyes moved over the plush velvet chairs, the original abstract art on the walls, and the few other patrons, all of whom were white and dressed in similar business attire. A familiar, unspoken awareness settled in him. Here, his first impression was never about the leather folio in his hand or the cut of his suit. It was about a narrative written long before he ever walked in. With a calm demeanor, he approached the main teller line. A young woman named Jenna offered a professional smile from behind the polished granite counter. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" Her voice was bright, practiced. "Good afternoon," Malcolm replied, his voice a low, steady baritone. "I'd like to cash this, please." He opened his folio, extracted a single cashier's check, and slid it across the smooth surface toward her. Jenna's eyes dropped to the check. Her pleasant smile remained fixed, but her pupils dilated slightly, and she blinked once, a tiny fracture in her professional composure. The amount was $850,000. "Oh," she said, the word escaping as a small breath. "Okay. One moment, sir." She picked up the check carefully, as if it were a rare artifact, her gaze darting from the paper to Malcolm's impassive face and back again. A procedural script ward with a sudden personal nervousness in her expression. I'll need to get my manager to approve this. It's policy for amounts over a certain threshold." "Of course," Malcolm said, offering a mild, reassuring nod. "No problem." Gay, he clasped his hands loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed but poised, a study in patience. Jenna picked up the phone at her station, turning slightly away. Malcolm could hear only a murmured fragment. "Large cashier's check. Gentleman at station 3. His gaze drifted past her through the glass wall of a nearby office. Inside, a man in his 50s with expensively cut salt and pepper hair looked up from his desk. This was Bradley Thornton, the branch manager. Jenna's discreet glance guided his attention directly to Malcolm. Bradley's eyes narrowed, not with recognition, but with a swift, calculating assessment. He didn't see a client. He saw a variable, an anomaly in his well-ordered ledger of expectations. Bradley Thornton stood, giving his suit jacket a sharp, practiced tug. He exuded an air of groomed authority. He exited the office and walked toward the counter with a measured, deliberate pace, his leather soles tapping softly on the marble floor. Malcolm watched him come, his own expression not changing, but a faint, knowing look in his eyes. He had seen this performance before. "Jenna, you needed me?" Bradley asked, arriving at the counter. His voice was smooth, but his smile was tight, confined to his mouth. "Yes, Mr. Thornton. This gentleman would like to cash this." Jenna handed the check over. Bradley's fingers took it. His eyes went first to the amount. He didn't flinch or startle. He simply went very still. The number sat there, a silent challenge. Then his eyes flicked up to Malcolm, then back down, scanning the issuing bank and the pay line. Malcolm Greer. He looked back at Malcolm, the thin smile still plastered on his face. "Miss Greer, is it?" "That's right," Malcolm affirmed. "I'm Bradley Thornton, the branch manager." He held up the check slightly. "Do you have identification with you, sir?" Malcolm was already reaching into his inner suit pocket. He produced his driver's license and slid it across the counter. Bradley picked it up, holding it beside the check, his gaze darting between the two documents as if solving a puzzle. The names matched perfectly, but this only seemed to deepen the line of suspicion between his eyebrows. The facts were correct, but the story they told didn't fit the one in his head. He handed the license back with a brief, almost dismissive motion. "I see," Bradley said, his tone cooling a degree. "Oh, and can I ask the nature of this transaction? How where this check originated?" "It's a proceeds check from the sale of a commercial property," Malcolm explained, his voice even and helpful. "The title company issued it this morning. All the details are on file with them." Bradley nodded slowly, the gesture conveying skepticism, not understanding. "I see, property sale. He glanced at the check again as if it might confess its own falsehood. "This is a very substantial amount, Mr. Greer. We have to be exceptionally careful. You understand?" "I do." "I'd expect nothing less," Malcolm replied, his calm unwavering. "The contact for first title is right there on the check. Their managing director, David Chen, is expecting your call. He can verify everything instantly." Bradley looked at the check, then at Malcolm. The man was too prepared, too unruffled. In Bradley's experience, honest people grew nervous under scrutiny. They stammered, they offered too much explanation. Malcolm's cool certainty felt like a provocation. A wall went up behind Bradley's eyes. His voice took on a colder, more formal edge, the polite veneer cracking to reveal the steel of his assumption. "Why don't you have a seat over there, Mr. Greer? This will require a more thorough verification. It may take some time." He didn't wait for an answer. Clutching the check, he turned and walked briskly back toward his glass-walled office, leaving Malcolm standing at the counter, the first faint chill of deliberate inconvenience settling in the air between them. Malcolm watched Bradley Thornton's retreating back, the manager's posture rigid with purpose. The dismissal was clear, but Malcolm simply inclined his head, a silent acknowledgement of the directive that changed nothing in his demeanor. He did not take a seat in the plush velvet chairs reserved for waiting clients. Instead, he remained standing near the counter, a quiet pillar of patience in the softly humming lobby. He placed his folio on the granite surface and withdrew his phone, scrolling through messages with an air of casual distraction. He was in no hurry, a fact that seemed to subtly unsettle the rhythm of the space around him. "Jenna?" The teller glanced at him, then quickly away, her fingers fidgeting with a pen on her desk. She offered a weak, apologetic smile, which Malcolm returned with a genuine one of his own, a small gesture meant to ease her obvious discomfort. He understood she was merely a conduit, following the protocol dictated from above. The real current of the interaction was flowing from behind the glass wall of the office. Through that transparent barrier, Malcolm could see Bradley seated at his large, tidy desk. The manager held the cashier's check in one hand, but he was not on the phone. He was not contacting David Chen at first title. Instead, he was staring at his computer screen, typing with deliberate keystrokes. "Oh, see it." He would glance at the check, then back to the monitor, his expression one of deep concentration. He was, Malcolm knew, likely running internal checks, looking for flags on the check number or the account, perhaps even pulling a soft credit report. It was a verification, yes, but not of the transaction. It was a verification of Malcolm himself, an attempt to audit the man rather than the instrument. Minutes stretched. The murmur of the bank seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons were subconsciously aware of a silent drama unfolding. An older woman at the next teller station finished her transaction and glanced curiously at Malcolm, who stood calmly before heading toward the exit. A businessman waiting for a private consultant watched the scene with idle interest over the top of a financial journal. Finally, Bradley Thornton stood up from his desk. He did not pick up the check. He left it there, a pale rectangle on the dark wood, and emerged from his office empty-handed. He walked back to the counter, his steps slower now, more measured. His earlier brisk authority was layered with something new, a performative gravity. "Mr. Greer," Bradley began, stopping a few feet from the counter, not reclaiming his previous spot behind it. He crossed his arms. "I've initiated our verification process. These things, as I'm sure you can appreciate, take time. Security is our paramount concern." "I appreciate that," Malcolm replied, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Were you able to reach David Chen? He should have been able to provide immediate confirmation." Bradley waved a hand, a dismissive gesture that brushed the question aside. "We have our own channels and protocols. They're comprehensive. We examine the check, the account history of the issuer, the patterns." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "The patterns, Mr. Greer, are often the most telling thing." The subtext hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. He was not talking about the check's patterns. "I see," Malcolm said, his voice still level. "And what have your channels told you so far?" "They've told me that this is an unusually large sum for a walk-in transaction," Bradley stated, as if revealing a key piece of evidence. "They've told me that caution is required. Frankly, they've told me to ask more questions." "Then ask them," Malcolm said, a faint edge of steel finally threading its way into his tone. He uncrossed his own arms and placed his hands lightly on the counter, leaning forward just an inch. It was a subtle shift from passive waiting to engaged confrontation. You have the contact to verify the source of the fund. You have my identification, which matches the payee line exactly. The check is a cashier's check from a reputable institution, the most secure instrument short of actual currency. Ask your questions, Mr. Thornton, or make the call you're avoiding. A faint flush crept up Bradley's neck. The directness was a challenge to his control of the narrative. He leaned in now, mirroring Malcolm's posture, but with a different energy, one of confrontation. He lowered his voice, but the force behind it made it carry. All right, let's ask a question. You say this is from a property sale. Commercial property. What kind of property? Where? A 4-story mixed-use building on the corner of Elm and 12th, sold to a development group out of Chicago. Malcolm's answer was immediate. Precise. And your role in that? Bradley pressed, his eyes searching for a stumble. I was the sole owner, Malcolm said. Bradley's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. It was a flicker of disbelief. The sole owner of a downtown commercial property. He stated it as a concept to be examined, not a fact to be accepted. Less correct. And your business, Mr. Greer? And your business, Mr. Greer? What is it that you do? I develop properties, Malcolm said. I buy them, I hold them. I sometimes sell them. It was too simple, too clean for Bradley. A man who developed properties didn't look like this, didn't walk in alone, didn't carry himself with this quiet, unassuming confidence. In Bradley's world, developers were loud, flashy, surrounded by assistants. They didn't cash checks. They had people to do that. The story was wrong. Therefore, the man must be wrong. I'm going to need more than that, Bradley said, straightening up, his voice regaining its official volume. I'm going to need documentation, proof of the sale, the purchase agreement, tax records, something substantive. Malcolm studied him for a long, silent moment. The request was not unreasonable in a vacuum, but the context made it an insult. They were far beyond standard procedure now. This was a fishing expedition, a demand for Malcolm to prove his own legitimacy to satisfy a private doubt. The cashier's check is the proof, Malcolm said, his words slow and clear. It is the final funded instrument issued after all those documents were verified by the title company and the banks involved. You are asking me to recreate a closed process. You are, with all due respect, doubting the integrity of several other major financial institutions instead of making a single phone call to the party who wrote this check. Bradley's patience, thin to begin with, snapped. The polite facade crumbled entirely. His voice lost its modulated bank manager calm. What I am doing, sir, is my job. This check raises questions. You raise questions. And until I am satisfied, this transaction is on hold. You can either provide the documentation I've requested, or you can take your business elsewhere. But you will not stand at my counter and lecture me on how to do my job. The words, sharp and final, echoed in the sudden quiet of the grand lobby. Every patron, every teller was now openly watching. The hum of business had stopped. All that remained was the stark line drawn in the polished marble floor between the two men. Malcolm Greer stood on one side, holding nothing but his composure. Bradley Thornton stood on the other, holding all the presumed authority of the bank. And between them, lying on a desk in a glass office, was a check for $850,000 that had become a battleground. The silence in the wake of Bradley Thornton's declaration was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of quiet where the soft whir of a computer fan from a back office sounded like a roar, and the clearing of a throat from a patron near the door was a seismic event. All eyes in the granite and velvet lobby were fixed on the two men at the counter. Malcolm Greer did not move. He did not flinch at the manager's raised voice or the public ultimatum. He simply absorbed it, his expression settling into something even more still, like the calm at the center of a storm. He glanced slowly around the room, making brief, deliberate contact with a few of the onlookers. An older man in a tweed jacket looked away, embarrassed. A younger woman in a business suit held his gaze for a second, her face a mask of uncomfortable sympathy. The other bank tellers were frozen, pretending to look at their screens but acutely aware of the rupture in their manager's polished world. Malcolm's attention returned to Bradley, who stood with his chest slightly puffed, breathing a little too quickly, satisfied with the firm boundary he had drawn. He had reasserted control, defined the space. his bank, his rules, his judgment. Take my business elsewhere, Malcolm repeated, his voice not much louder than a murmur, yet it carried perfectly in the quiet. He said it not as a question, but as a contemplation, as if examining the phrase for its true meaning. He gave a slow single nod. "Ooh, I see. So this is no longer about verification. This is a refusal of service." Bradley's confidence wavered for a microsecond, hearing it stated so plainly. He recovered, adopting a tone of exasperated reason. "It is about security, Mr. Greer. I have a fiduciary duty to this institution and its clients. If something seems irregular, I have not only the right but the obligation to intervene. This is not personal." Malcolm's eyes, dark and steady, locked onto Bradley's. "Isn't it?" The two words hung in the air, simple and devastating. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The entire uncomfortable performance, the ignored contact, the forensic scrutiny of him rather than the check, the demand for layers of documentation already proven elsewhere, spoke the truth louder than any accusation could. Bradley flushed again, this time with a mix of anger and a dawning, prickling awareness that he was being seen through. "I don't like what you're implying," he said, his voice hardening. "I am not implying anything," Malcolm said, finally taking a step back from the counter, creating a physical space that mirrored the chasm between them. "I am observing a sequence of events. You saw a check for a large amount. You saw me. You concluded a story.
What concluded us?
And now you are adhering to that story, despite being offered a simple, factual path to disprove it. That, Mr. Thornton, is the very definition of a personal judgment." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew his phone. The movement was calm, deliberate. He didn't look at Bradley as he did it. He simply unlocked the screen with a tap of his thumb. "What are you doing?" Bradley asked, a note of suspicion edging his voice. "I am taking you at your word," Malcolm replied, his eyes on his phone. "You have declined to serve me. You have suggested I go elsewhere. I am making the necessary arrangements to do so." He began to scroll through his contacts, his thumb moving with purpose. A wave of smug relief washed over Bradley's face. This was the retreat he had demanded. The man was conceding. He couldn't help but turn slightly, addressing the room at large with a weary put-upon sigh playing to his audience. "It's unfortunate, but we have to be vigilant. These days, the schemes are very sophisticated. They look right. They feel right. But we have to trust our instincts." He was narrating his victory, framing his prejudice as professional diligence. Malcolm paid no visible attention to the speech. He found the contact he was looking for and raised the phone to his ear. He turned his back slightly to Bradley, not fully, but enough to create a sliver of privacy. The lobby was so quiet they could all hear the soft electronic purr of the call connecting. After 2 rings, it was answered. Malcolm's voice was low, composed, and utterly clear. Yes, it's Malcolm Greer. I'm at the downtown branch, Granite National. There's an issue with the transaction. No, the funds aren't in question. The manager, a Mr. Bradley Thornton, has refused to process a valid cashier's check and has declined service. Yes, I'm here now. I understand. Thank you." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned back to face the room. He did not look at Bradley. Instead, he leaned casually against the counter, his arms crossed and focused on a point somewhere in the middle distance, as if waiting for a bus. The message was clear. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Bradley stared at him, confused and newly irritated. The phone call hadn't sounded like someone arranging alternative banking. It had sounded like a report, a calm, factual report. "Who was that?" Bradley demanded, his earlier smugness evaporating. "That," Malcolm said, finally meeting his gaze again. "It was me taking my business elsewhere just as you suggested. You should expect a call shortly." His tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of threat or gloating. It was simply a statement of coming events. A flicker of real anxiety, cold and sharp, pierced Bradley's indignation. A call? From whom? The man had said, "I understand. Thank you." Who thanks someone for giving them bad news? The narrative in Bradley's mind, so solid a moment ago, began to develop a hairline fracture. He had expected bluster, argument, or defeated departure. He had not expected this quiet, unnerving certainty. "I expect a call from who?" Bradley pressed, his voice losing some of its force. Malcolm offered a small, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. From the elsewhere, Mr. Thornton." The elsewhere, Mr. Thornton. He pushed off from the counter and walked calmly over to one of the plush velvet chairs. He sat down, crossed his legs, and picked up a copy of The Economist from a side table. He opened it and began to read a picture of absolute unshakable patience. Bradley Thornton remained standing by the now empty counter, the eyes of the entire lobby upon him. He had won the argument, forced the man to sit down, but it felt like a defeat. The man he had just refused service was now sitting in his lobby like he owned the place, waiting for a phone call that filled the expensive air with a silent, ticking dread. The line had been drawn, but Malcolm Greer had just stepped over it and made himself at home. Bradley Thornton stood adrift in the center of his own lobby. The familiar, controlled ecosystem of his bank had been thrown into disarray by the man now sitting calmly in a velvet chair, reading a magazine. Malcolm Greer had transformed from a customer into a fixture, an immovable object radiating quiet consequence. The air, once cool with circulated scent-filtered air, now felt thick and charred. Bradley could feel the weight of every glance from his tellers, every curious peek from the remaining clients. He had to reassert control. He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture he despised, and walked with forced purpose back to his glass office. His retreat felt like just that, a retreat. Once inside, he closed the door, though it did nothing to block the view. He sat heavily in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes darting to the cashier's check still lying on his desk. It seemed to mock him. He snatched it up, studying it again as if new answers might have materialized on the paper. The details were flawless. The issuing bank was Premier. The signature was official. But the man didn't fit. Who did he call? The question clawed at Bradley's mind. A lawyer? A lawyer? Some mid-level compliance officer at a rival bank? The man's calm suggested resources, but his appearance suggested otherwise. It was this dissonance that Bradley's instincts, honed in this world of surface signals, refused to reconcile. He decided to weaponize the weight. Let the man sit. Let him grow impatient, maybe even angry. Anger would confirm the fraud. Legitimate businessmen didn't throw tantrums in bank lobbies. He busied himself with paperwork, shooting occasional scowls through the glass. Malcolm, however, did not look up. He turned a page of The Economist. He adjusted his cuff. He checked his watch once, not with anxiety, but with the mild interest of someone monitoring a scheduled appointment. 15 minutes passed. The tension in the lobby began to curdle into awkwardness. A client wanting to make a deposit hesitated, looking from the seated Malcolm to Bradley's office before finally approaching a teller in a hushed tone. The normal noise level, a soft hum of transactions, was gone, replaced by whispers and the occasional, overly loud typing from a teller trying to seem busy. Driven by a need to dominate the narrative again, Bradley emerged from his office. He didn't approach Malcolm. Instead, he walked to the central teller station and leaned casually against it, crossing his arms. He spoke in a voice meant to be confidential but calculated to carry. "It's a shame, you know," he said to Jenna and the other teller, his tone one of weary experience. The lengths people will go to. They research, they forge documents, they learn the right things to say. It can be very convincing to the untrained eye. Gina looked down at her keyboard, her cheeks flushing. The other teller nodded nervously. But we're trained," Bradley continued, his gaze sweeping briefly toward Malcolm. We see the inconsistencies, the story that doesn't quite add up. A real property developer doesn't just walk in alone to cash an $800,000 check. They have people. They wire funds. This, he gave a slight dismissive shake of his head. This is theater. This is theater. And the best thing we can do is not play our part. Eventually the actor gets tired and leaves. Malcolm turned a page. The rustle of paper was loud in the stillness. Bradley felt a spike of irritation at being ignored. He pushed off the counter and took a few steps toward the seating area, stopping a polite but firm distance away. "Mr. Greer, is there something else I can help you with? As I said, the process will take considerable time. You might be more comfortable waiting elsewhere." Malcolm lowered the magazine and looked at him, his expression one of polite curiosity. "I am comfortable, thank you. And I believe you'll be receiving a call soon. I'd hate to miss it." "A call regarding what exactly?" Bradley's patience was fraying, the performative calm cracking. Regarding your refusal of service and your public insinuations about my character and the legality of my financial instrument, Malcolm stated, as if reading from a ledger. That seems like something a branch manager would want to be present for, don't you think? Bradley's mouth went dry. The man wasn't bluffing. He was documenting. I made no insinuations. I followed procedure. You told your staff within my earshot and that of other clients that I was engaged in theater akin to a fraud scheme, Malcolm said, his voice still even. That sounds like an insinuation. Slander, even. This is ridiculous. Bradley's voice rose, echoing off the marble. A few heads snapped up. I will not be threatened in my own bank. No one is threatening you, Mr. Thornton, Malcolm said, returning to his magazine. I am simply waiting for the next step in the process you initiated. The elsewhere is coming here, it seems. Before Bradley could form a retort, the main doors of the bank swung open. The sound was different from the soft chime of customer traffic. It was a swift, decisive swoosh of air. 3 people entered. They moved as a unit, their energy immediately displacing the lethargic tension in the room. In the lead was a tall, sharp-featured woman in a navy blazer and tailored trousers, her silver-streaked hair in a severe, elegant bun. Her eyes, behind minimalist glasses, scanned the lobby and found Bradley Thornton instantly. Behind her were 2 men, similarly dressed in dark, expensive suits, their expressions neutral but intent. They were not customers. They were a tribunal. Every employee behind the counter stiffened. The whispering among the few remaining clients ceased entirely. Bradley felt a cold dread pool in his stomach. He recognized the woman. It was Gabriella Sorensen, the regional director of operations for Granite National Bank. She had visited the branch only once before, for a 5-minute walkthrough during a merger review. She was a legend whispered about in managerial meetings. Ruthlessly efficient, intellectually fierce, and intolerant of anything that threatened the bank's reputation or bottom line. Her heels struck the marble floor with a sound like cracking ice as she led her small procession directly toward Bradley. He instinctively stood up straighter, his hands flexing at his sides. She bypassed him completely, her gaze landing on Malcolm Greer, who had neatly folded his magazine and set it aside as he rose to his feet. A smile, genuine and warm, broke across Gabriella Sorensen's stern face. Malcolm, she said, extending both hands. I came the moment I got your call. I am so sorry you've been put through this. The use of his first name, the warmth, the apology. Bradley's world tilted on its axis, the floor seeming to lurch beneath his polished shoes. Malcolm took her hands, his own smile slight but gracious. Gabriella, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I knew you'd want this handled properly. She squeezed his hands before releasing them, and then, with a physical pivot that seemed to shift the gravity of the entire room, she turned to face Bradley Thornton. All warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a look of glacial disappointment. "Oh, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice now a blade sheathed in silk. My office received a deeply concerning call from our majority shareholder. He reports an egregious failure of service and professionalism at your branch. Would you care to explain? No. The word hung in the marbled air, each syllable a hammer blow to Bradley Thornton's reality. Majority shareholder. They echoed, detached from meaning, then crashed into him with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained from his face so completely he felt lightheaded, the polished lobby tilting on its edge. His mouth opened, but only a dry, hollow sound emerged. He looked from Gabriella Sorensen's icy, disappointed face to Malcolm Greer's calm, unreadable one. The man he had accused of fraud of theater was not a customer. He was the owner. There must be... Bradley stammered, the words choking in his throat. His polished facade shattered into 1,000 pieces of sheer panic. He gripped the edge of a nearby desk, his knuckles white. Misenlist first. Sorensen, I had no idea. He didn't. There was no indication. Dedication. Gabriella's voice was lethally quiet, cutting through his sputtering. What indication were you waiting for, Mr. Thornton? A crown? A signed proclamation? His name is on the corporate registry, on the quarterly reports you are supposed to read. His signature is on the bylaws of the institution you manage a branch of. She took a step closer, and he shrank back instinctively. Your job was to verify a check, not to conduct a biased inquisition into the legitimacy of the man presenting it. You were given a direct line to the issuing authority. Did you call it? Bradley's silence was answer enough. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through him as he remembered dismissing the contact, dismissing him. No, Gabriella answered for him, the word final. You did not. You chose instead to make a series of escalating, discriminatory assumptions in the middle of the bank lobby. She turned slightly, encompassing the stunned tellers and the handful of frozen customers in her gaze, in front of staff and clients. You turned a routine transaction into a public spectacle of prejudice. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice not raised, but it carried the absolute authority of the room. The question wasn't about the check, Mr. Thornton. You decided it was about me. The moment you saw me, you stopped seeing a client and started seeing a problem to be managed. Your instincts, as you called them while explaining my criminality to your staff, were just your bias speaking in a suit. A soft, collective gasp rippled through the space. A man near the windows dropped his coffee cup into its saucer with a sharp clatter. Soul. Jenna, the teller, had both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and a dawning understanding of the part she had played. Bradley felt the weight of every stare like a physical pressure. The shame was a fire on his skin. He tried to find footing, any footing. The procedure for such a large amount, it's red flagged. And the procedure for a red flag is to verify, not to accuse. Gabriella snapped, her composure cracking for a moment to reveal raw fury. The procedure is to pick up the phone, not to pontificate on fraud to an audience. You embarrassed this man, you attempted to humiliate him, but in doing so, you have humiliated this brand, and yourself. She turned to one of the severe-suited men behind her. James, please retrieve the check from Mr. Thornton's office and process it for Mr. Greer immediately. Use the chairman's line. No further verification is required. The man, James, nodded and moved swiftly toward Bradley's office, past the paralyzed manager as if he were furniture. Bradley watched him go, the last shred of his authority vanishing with the M.O. squonking to his own bank. He looked back at Malcolm, a desperate, confused plea in his eyes. Why didn't you just say something? Malcolm studied him, and for the first time, Bradley saw not anger but a profound, weary disappointment. Say what? Malcolm asked. That I own the bank. Should I have had to? Should my word, my identification, a legally binding financial instrument from a top-tier institution only become valid when paired with a title you deem powerful enough? He shook his head slowly. If I had said it, you would have thought I was lying. Another part of the theater? What's another part of the theater? You had already written your story. I wanted you to see how it ends. Gabriella interjected, her tone shifting to one of formal, devastating resolution. Mr. Thornton, effective immediately, you are suspended. Pending a full investigation by HR and the compliance department, you are to leave the premises. Your access is revoked. We will be conducting a forensic review of all your client interactions, particularly those involving large transactions or clients who may not have fit your personal profile of legitimacy. Suspended. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. His career, his reputation, his entire identity crumbling because he had refused to make a phone call to a man he had judged unworthy of one. James returned, holding a certified bank check, the funds having been instantly transferred. He handed it with both hands to Malcolm. Mr. Greer. Again, our deepest apologies. Malcolm took the check, slipping it into his folio without looking at it. The money was now the least significant part of the transaction. He looked at the staff behind the counter, at the customers, and finally back at the broken man before him. This isn't just about you and me, Bradley, Malcolm said, his voice resonant in the silent hall. It's about a system that empowers your kind of thinking. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who has to prove their humanity before they can access their own money. You didn't just fail at your job today. You demonstrated why so many people distrust the very institutions built to serve them. He paused, letting the truth settle onto the cold marble floor where everyone could see it. Now, Malcolm said, his gaze sweeping the room before landing back on Gabriella. I believe there are some broader lessons this branch needs to learn, and everyone here is going to learn them together. He gestured toward the center of the lobby. The lesson was not over. The owner had just arrived, and the real business was about to begin. A profound silence gripped the lobby, deeper than before. It was the silence of awe, of shock, of collective breath held. All eyes were fixed on Malcolm Greer as he stood in the center of the marble floor, Gabriella Sorensen a respectful half-step behind him. He was no longer the patient man in the suit, nor the aggrieved customer. He was the source of the gravity in the room. He carefully placed his folio on a low glass table and turned to face the assembly, the frozen tellers, the wide-eyed customers, the broken manager. He began, his voice calm, clear and carrying to every corner without strain. It was not the voice of a man delivering a triumphant "I told you so." It was the voice of a teacher beginning a difficult, necessary lesson. A few minutes ago, Malcolm started, his gaze sweeping slowly across the faces of the other patrons. Many of you watched what happened here. Some of you were uncomfortable. Some were curious. Some, perhaps, agreed with Mr. Thornton's initial assessment. He paused, letting the honesty of that statement settle. A few people looked down at their shoes. Well, you saw a bank manager in a position of authority challenge a client. On the surface, that can look like diligence. But you also heard the tone. You saw the refusal to use the simple tool of a telephone. You witnessed the shift from verifying a document to interrogating a person. He took a few slow steps toward the teller line. Gina flinched, as if expecting blame. Malcolm stopped and offered her a small, kind nod. "Oh," he said to her, his voice softening. "You follow the protocol you were given. You called your manager. Your role in this ends there. This is not about you." Jenna's shoulders slumped in visible relief, her eyes glistening. Malcolm's focus shifted back to the room. This is about what happens when procedure is poisoned by presumption. I walked into my own bank, a place where, on paper, my authority is absolute, and was reduced to a suspect because I didn't match an unspoken, unwritten profile. Mr. Thornton did not see a shareholder. He did not see a client. He saw a narrative. A black man with a large check must be explained. There must be a story, and in his mind the only possible stories were fraud, crime, or delusion. He let the starkness of those words hang. A woman in the seating area nodded slowly, her face pale. This institution, and Malcolm continued gesturing to the rich wood and brass around them, is built on trust. It is a vault for people's lives, their work, their futures. That trust is shattered the moment we decide who is worthy of it based on anything other than facts. Today, that trust was shattered for me. And if it could be shattered for me, the majority owner, imagine how fragile it is for every other person who walks through that door looking a little different, sounding a little different, or simply not fitting the silent script of what wealth is supposed to look like. He turned now to Gabriella Sorensen. Gabriella, what is the first line of our corporate value statement?" Gabriella stood straighter, her voice crisp and clear in the quiet. "Integrity without exception. Service without bias. Integrity without exception," Malcolm repeated, turning his eyes to Bradley, who seemed to be shrinking into his suit. "That means the integrity to make a phone call you don't want to make. Service without bias. That means service does not begin after you've satisfied your personal curiosity about a client's biography." He walked over to stand directly before Bradley Thornton. The manager could not meet his gaze. He stared at the ornate pattern in the marble floor as if wishing it would swallow him. "You spoke of instinct, Bradley," Malcolm said, his voice low but audible to all. "You told your staff to trust their instincts. You were wrong. In our business, instinct is prejudice in a necktie. Our job is to follow facts. Your instincts today were a liability. They cost you your position, and they have damaged the reputation of this branch profoundly." Malcolm then addressed the staff behind the counter. "Each of you are now part of this story. You have a choice. You can be bystanders who watched a man be humiliated, or you can be the people who ensure it never happens again. Starting tomorrow, this branch will begin mandatory, intensive retraining on implicit bias and ethical client service led by Miss Sorensen's team. It will not be a corporate webinar you ignore. It will be a deep, uncomfortable, and necessary examination of how we all see the people we serve." He finally turned back to the small audience of customers. "And to you, the clients. You trusted this institution with your assets. You should demand more from it than what you saw today. Demand the integrity promised on the brochures. If you see something like this, whether it's happening to you or to someone else, say something. Silence is the oxygen that allows this kind of behavior to breathe." The room was utterly still, absorbing the speech. It was not a fiery rant. It was a surgical dissection, cold, precise, and devastatingly accurate. Malcolm picked up his folio. The immediate lesson was delivered. Gabriella stepped forward, her voice filling the administrative void. Mr. Thornton, you will now gather your personal items from your office under supervision. You are to leave the premises. The rest of the staff, please return to your stations. We will be meeting in the conference room in 1 hour for an initial briefing. The spell broke. A soft murmur rose as people began to move, charged with a new electric energy. Tellers sat back down at their computers, their movements stiff and self-conscious. Two of Gabriella's aides moved to escort Bradley to his office. But Malcolm wasn't finished. He walked to the door, then paused, turning for one final look at the scene. The humbled staff, the thoughtful customers, the shadow of a disgraced manager being led away. The dismantling was complete. Now, the harder work of rebuilding would begin. He had not just cashed a check today, he had exposed a fatal flaw in the machine. And as the owner, the responsibility for fixing it was his. He gave a final slow nod and pushed the door open, stepping back into the sunlight of the city, the echo of his words left behind to reverberate through the vaulted space. The grand oak door of Granite National Bank swung shut behind Malcolm Greer, sealing the lobby into a tomb of stunned silence. The air, once vibrating with his quiet authority, now felt hollow and charged with the aftermath. For a long moment, no one moved. The staff behind the counter stood like statues, their eyes fixed on the spot where the owner had just been standing. The remaining customers, a handful of witnesses to a corporate earthquake, seemed unsure if they were allowed to breathe. Gabriella Sorensen was the first to break the spell. She clapped her hands once, a sharp, efficient sound that made everyone jump. All right, the spectacle is over. The work begins now. Her gaze swept over the tellers. Achina, Michael, Sarah, please see to our clients. Process any pending transactions with the utmost professionalism. The rest of you, begin closing procedures for your stations. We will all meet in the main conference room in 50 minutes for a mandatory briefing. Her instructions were a lifeline, a return to concrete action in a world that had just been turned upside down. The tellers scrambled into motion, their movements stiff and overly deliberate, afraid of making another wrong move. The soft beeping of keyboards and the whir of receipt printers started up again, creating a frail semblance of normalcy. Across the lobby, Bradley Thornton stood under the watchful eyes of James, one of Gabriella's aides. He looked decades older. The commanding posture, the smug certainty, had collapsed inward. He moved toward his glass office like a man walking to the gallows, his shoulders slumped. James followed him inside, leaving the door open. From the lobby, the staff could see Bradley standing by his desk, staring blankly at its clean surface. He opened a drawer, removed a silver picture frame, a family photo from a happier, more confident time, and placed it in a small cardboard box James had produced. The act was slow, ceremonial, and utterly devastating. He was being erased from his own kingdom in real time. At the teller counter, Jenna finished helping a flustered customer and then leaned toward her colleague. Michael, her voice a desperate whisper. He said it wasn't about me. He looked right at me and said that. Michael, an older man with a tired face, kept his eyes on his screen. He was being kind. We all saw. We all heard Thornton, and we all just stood there. What were we supposed to do? Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Contradict the manager? Maybe, Michael said softly, finally looking at her. Maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to do from now on. At the seating area, the customers were processing the event in hushed, intense conversations. The woman in the business suit spoke to the older man in tweed. He owns the bank, she said, not for the first time, as if trying to make the fact real. The manager was interrogating his boss. It's biblical. The older man nodded, his expression grave. It wasn't just about power, though. Did you hear him? It was about the machinery of it. He said Thornton saw a narrative. We all do it, don't we? Make little snap judgments. His just happened to destroy his career. Makes you wonder, the woman replied, glancing toward the tellers, if you've ever been on the other side of that look and just didn't know it. Gabriella, meanwhile, was already on her phone, her voice low and intense as she paced a small circuit on the marble floor. Yes, I need the full HR and compliance team deployed to the downtown branch tomorrow at 8 a.m. No, it's a code-level event. Client discrimination, public humiliation, gross procedural failure by the manager. The client was Malcolm Greer. Yes, that Malcolm Greer. So treat it with the gravity it deserves. We'll be conducting staff interviews and a full audit, and draft a communication for all regional branches about today, emphasizing zero tolerance for bias in client interactions. Use it as a case study. A painful one. She ended the call and looked toward Bradley's office. James was now standing by the door as Bradley placed a final few items, a fancy pen, a stress ball with the bank's logo, into the box. He had taken off his suit jacket. In his shirt sleeves, he looked smaller, vulnerable, and utterly defeated. Gabriella walked over and stood in the doorway. Bradley. Her use of his first name was not kind. It was administrative. He looked up, his eyes hollow. The investigation will be thorough. You will be contacted by Hare with next steps. For now, you are to have no contact with any bank staff or clients regarding this matter. Is that clear? He nodded, a jerky mechanical motion. A clear. His voice was a rasp. James will see you out. With that, she turned her back on him, a final and profound dismissal. Box in hand, Bradley Thornton walked out of his office for the last time. He did not look at his former staff. He kept his eyes on the floor. A beaten man paraded past the scene of his crime. The click of his shoes on the marble was the only sound. James opened the main door for him, and Bradley stepped through it, back into the indifferent bustle of the city, the polished brass door closing softly behind him, locking him out forever. Inside, the atmosphere did not lighten with his departure. If anything, it grew heavier. His absence was a vacuum filled with collective guilt and dawning responsibility. The easy villain was gone, leaving behind the more complicated truth. He was a symptom, not the sole disease. The silence that returned was contemplative and charged with a new fear. The fear of having to look at themselves and at the system they had all accepted with the same unflinching clarity Malcolm Greer had just demonstrated. Gabriella walked to the center of the lobby, the staff's eyes drawn to her. The briefing in 45 minutes, she announced. Come prepared to listen and to speak honestly. This is no longer about one man's mistake. This is about who we are, and who we are going to choose to be from this moment forward. She turned and walked toward the conference room, leaving them alone with the weight of the question hanging in the expensive, tainted air. The main conference room of Granite National Bank's downtown branch was a space designed for confidence. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. A large screen dominated one wall. It was a room for presenting robust quarterly earnings, not for dissecting a profound moral and professional failure. The air inside was thick with a stifling anxiety, smelling of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Gabriella Sorensen stood at the head of the table, the entire branch staff, tellers, financial advisors, loan officers, and operations personnel seated before her. The empty chair where Bradley Thornton usually sat was a glaring, silent accusation. No one looked at it. We are not here today for a routine meeting, Gabriella began, her voice stripped of any warmth. It was the voice of a surgeon stating facts before an operation. What transpired in our lobby was not an isolated incident. It was the catastrophic failure of a system of assumptions that overrode protocol, decency, and our core values. Mr. Greer could have had any one of you dismissed with a word. He chose not to. He has, instead, given this branch a chance to reform itself. Consider it an act of extraordinary mercy you do not deserve. She let that hang, watching the staff shrink slightly in their seats. Gina stared at her hands folded tightly in her lap. We will now watch something, Gabriella said, picking up a remote. The large screen flickered to life. Life. It was security footage from the lobby, time-stamped from that afternoon. The angle was high and wide, capturing the entire scene in silent, damning clarity. They watched Malcolm Greer approach Jenna's station, saw the polite exchange. They saw Bradley Thornton arrive. The video had no audio, but it didn't need it. The body language was a script they could all now read. Bradley's dismissive posture, his forensic examination of the ID, his retreat without making the call. They saw him later, leaning against the counter, holding court with his tellers, his gestures clearly narrative, his head nodding toward Malcolm, who sat patiently in the background. Watching it from this detached God's eye view was horrifying. It was not a drama. It was a clinical display of bias in motion. They saw their own faces in the footage. The tellers who listened to Bradley, the customers who watched with curiosity but not intervention. They saw themselves as part of the machinery. Gabriella paused the video on a frame of Bradley speaking to Gina and Michael, his expression one of smug certainty. "This," she said, pointing at the screen, "is a contagion. It spreads through silence, through nervous laughter, through the desire not to make waves. Each of you, by your action or inaction, became a vector. You are all infected. The treatment starts now." She launched into a blunt, unsparing outline of the coming days. Mandatory bias training, not as a checkbox seminar, but as an immersive workshop with facilitators and psychologists. A review of every transaction over $10,000 from the past year, specifically analyzing client demographics and any flags or delays. Secret shoppers from a diversity-focused firm would be visiting regularly. Performance reviews would now include peer assessments on ethical conduct and client respect. Your job security, Gabriella stated coldly, is now directly tied to your demonstrable commitment to creating an environment where what happened to Mr. Greer is impossible. If that makes you uncomfortable, your resignation will be accepted immediately. The room was deathly quiet. The weight of the change was immense, terrifying. It was easier to blame one bad apple than to accept that the whole orchard needed digging up. Just then, a soft knock echoed at the conference room door. All heads turned. James, the aide, opened the door and leaned in. "Mr. Schwan Sorensen, apologies for the interruption. Mr. Greer has returned. He's asking to speak with Gina if it's permissible." A fresh wave of tension crashed through the room. Every eye shot to Gina, who went pale. "He's come back for me." Her expression screamed. He wasn't merciful after all. Gabriella, surprised but composed, nodded. "Of course." "Jenna, you may be excused." Jenna stood on unsteady legs, her chair scraping loudly in the silence. She walked out of the conference room like a prisoner going to sentencing, her heart hammering against her ribs. Malcolm Greer was not in the lobby. He was waiting for her in the small, private client meeting room off to the side, a quiet, wood-paneled space with 2 armchairs. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city, but turned as she entered. He had changed his suit jacket for a softer navy blazer, but his presence was no less imposing. "Jenna," he said, his voice calm. Please, close the door and sit down." She did, perching on the edge of the armchair, her back rigid. He sat across from her, studying her for a moment. "You think I'm here to fire you," he stated. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "I'm not," he said. "I told you in the lobby it wasn't about you. I meant that. You were placed in an impossible position by a man in authority. I watched you. You were nervous, but you were polite. You followed the rules you were given. The failure was not yours to own." A sob of relief and pent-up terror caught in Gina's chest. I should have said something when he started talking like that. I knew it was wrong." Knowing it was wrong in your gut and having the power to challenge your manager in front of clients are 2 very different things," Malcolm replied. "That power imbalance is part of the problem. My conversation with you now isn't about blame. It's about the future." He leaned forward slightly. "You are now a witness to how not to run a bank. You have seen the cost. I am here to ask you, not order you, ask you to be part of fixing it. Will you volunteer for the branch's new ethics committee? Will you speak up in those trainings not as an accused, but as someone who was on the floor when it happened? Your perspective from right there at the counter is invaluable." Jenna stared at him, stunned. He wasn't punishing her. He was recruiting her. He was offering her agency where before she had none. You want me to help?" "I need people who have seen the crack in the foundation to help seal it," he said. "It requires courage. More than you needed this afternoon, but it's the only way the lesson becomes real." He reached into his blazer's inner pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card, different from the one he'd mentioned earlier. He placed it on the table between them. "This is my direct line. Not for banking. If you ever see something happening, here or anywhere in your life, that feels like what happened today, and you feel powerless to stop it, you call me. We will navigate it together. Consider it a lesson in a different kind of power." He stood up. Jenna, awestruck, rose shakily to her feet. The choice is yours, Jenna," Malcolm said, extending his hand. "You can be a victim of today, or you can be an architect of tomorrow." After a heartbeat, she took his hand. Her grip was firm, her decision made in that instant. "I'll be on the committee," she said, her voice finding a new strength. Thank you, Mr. Greer." He smiled, a genuine one that reached his eyes for the first time all day. No," he said. Thank you." He nodded once and left the room, leaving Gina standing there holding the business card, the weight of the afternoon transforming from a burden of fear into a mantle of responsibility. The infection, as Gabriella had called it, had just found its first antibody. Malcolm Greer stepped out of the private meeting room, leaving Jenna with the weight and potential of the business card in her hand. The lobby was different now. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble floor. The usual closing time bustle was absent, replaced by a hushed, focused energy. Tellers balanced their drawers with unusual solemnity. A loan officer spoke to a client in a voice so respectful, it was nearly a whisper. The shock of the day had hardened into a new, brittle form of professionalism. The air itself seemed aware of being watched. He did not linger. He moved with purpose toward the main doors, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Heads turned subtly, then snapped back to work. He was no longer an anonymous man or a problem to be solved. He was a walking monument to consequence. As he passed the now empty manager's office, the glass wall seemed to reflect the entire day's folly. The tidy desk, the empty chair. It was a clean, stark exhibit of a career erased by prejudice. Malcolm did not pause to look inside. The lesson was not in the emptiness, but in the reason for it. Just before he reached the door, a voice soft and tentative called out, "Mr. Greer." He turned. It was the older gentleman in the tweed jacket, the one who had been a witness from the plush chairs. The man approached, ringing a fedora in his hands, his expression one of profound discomfort. "Yes," Malcolm said, his tone neutral, allowing the man space. I just wanted to say," the man began, his voice trembling slightly. "I was sitting right there. I heard it all. And I didn't say a thing." He looked down at his hat, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. "I'm ashamed. I thought it was none of my business. But you were right. Silence it's complicity. I'm sorry, truly." Malcolm studied him for a moment, the genuine regret, the awkward courage it took to approach him now. This, perhaps, was the most important ripple. Thank you for telling me that," Malcolm said, his voice quieter, more personal. "It's harder to speak up in the moment than it is to carry the regret afterward. Remember that feeling. Let it remind you that your voice matters next time, not just for me, but for anyone." The man nodded vigorously, his eyes glistening. "I will. I promise I will." He seemed to want to say more, but simply extended his hand. Malcolm shook it, a firm, forgiving clasp. The man then turned and hurried away, as if unburdened. Malcolm pushed through the heavy brass doors and emerged onto the Nashville sidewalk. The city's soundscape, the rumble of buses, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren, rushed in, a wave of vibrant, indifferent life. It was a jarring, welcome contrast to the cloistered, tense atmosphere of the bank. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the unconditioned air. He walked a half block down the street and stopped, turning to look back at the building. Granite National. Its neoclassical facade was imposing, a deliberate projection of stability and permanence. For years, he had seen it as an asset in a portfolio, a stream of revenue, a node in a network. Today he had seen its soul, or the troubling lack thereof. He had seen how easily its authority could be weaponized by small minds, how its grandeur could intimidate the very people it was meant to serve. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, a text from Gabriella Sorensen. "Gabriella, staff briefing was brutal and necessary. Thornton is gone. Retraining starts tomorrow at 8 a.m. The committee is being formed. We will not fail this test." He typed a reply, his thumbs moving slowly. "Malcolm, I know you won't. The test isn't for a week or a month. It's forever. Thank you for acting with speed and principle." He slipped the phone away, his gaze still fixed on the bank. The drama inside was over, but the real work was just beginning. The tedious, unglamorous work of policy reviews, training sessions, cultural audits. It was work that would not make for a compelling story, but it was the only work that mattered. He had wielded his power today like a scalpel, cutting out a tumor. Now came the years of chemotherapy, the diligent, ongoing treatment to ensure it didn't grow back. He thought of Jenna's frightened face transforming into one of resolve. He thought of the old man's shame-faced apology. These were small embers in the wake of a fire. They were not nothing. A young couple, laughing and holding hands, walked between him and the bank, momentarily blocking his view. They were oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred within its walls. Life, relentless and joyful, moved on. And that, he realized, was the final lesson. Injustice occurs in the specific, in quiet moments in marble lobbies. Justice is not a dramatic event, but a slow correction, a realignment of 1,000 small interactions so that people like that couple, of any color or creed, would never have their joy interrupted by a man like Bradley Thornton again. His role as the avenging owner was done. His longer, harder role as the reforming steward began. With one last thoughtful look at the building. His building, Malcolm Greer turned, tucked his folio under his arm, and melted into the flow of the downtown crowd. Just another man in a suit, carrying a secret history and a determined hope for what could be built from the ruins of a single, shameful afternoon. 1 week later, the downtown branch of Granite National Bank opened under a different sky. The physical space was unchanged. The same marble gleamed. The same chandeliers glittered. But the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered. It was quieter, more deliberate. The staff moved with a focused precision, their interactions with clients punctuated by conscious eye contact and measured, respectful tones. It was as if the entire branch was collectively holding its breath, determined not to exhale the old air. At 9:15 a.m., a black woman in elegant professional attire entered, holding a folder. She was approached not just by a teller, but by a senior financial advisor who had completed the new bias training the day before. "Good morning. Welcome. How can we assist you today?" The advisor's voice was warm, his posture open. The transaction, a complex international wire initiation, was handled with efficient grace, the advisor verifying details thoroughly but without a hint of the skeptical, probing energy that had once poisoned the space. The woman left with a surprised but pleased expression. The first test of the new protocol had been passed silently and successfully. In the back office, the ethics committee, Jenna among them, sitting a little taller, was reviewing the finalized plan for quarterly blind audits of service quality. In the conference room, Gabriella Sorensen was concluding a video call with the bank's national leadership, presenting the downtown branch as a living case study for systemic reform. And in the manager's office, now occupied by an interim director from another branch, a small, discreet plaque had been placed on the wall behind the desk. It was not for clients to see, it was for the person sitting in the chair. It read, "My service begins before you know the balance." Respect is the only non-negotiable currency. Malcolm Greer did not visit that day. He monitored the reports, read the training summaries, and approved the new compliance structure. His role was now one of oversight, not intervention. The goal was not for him to be a constant looming presence, but for his values to become embedded in the walls. That evening, as the branch closed and the staff left, some exhausted, some energized, all thoughtful, Jenna was the last teller to finish her cash drawer. As she bundled the receipts, she saw a familiar figure through the glass door. It was Bradley Thornton. He stood across the street, still in a suit but looking untethered, watching the bank as employees trickled out. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He looked like a ghost haunting the scene of his demise, trying to understand the life that continued without him. Jenna felt a pang, not of sympathy, but of a sobering understanding. His story was a warning etched into the very foundation of her career now. She turned off her station light and left through the back entrance, the image of him lingering, a stark reminder of the cost of the old way. The following Saturday, Malcolm was at a charity luncheon for urban entrepreneurs. A young man, a startup founder, approached him during the networking hour. "Hey, Mr. Greer," he said, his voice edged with nervous admiration. "I heard a story about what happened at your bank. They say you taught them all a lesson they'll never forget." Malcolm took a sip of water, his expression unassuming. "It wasn't a lesson I wanted to teach," he replied. "It was a failure I had to address. But you own the bank." The young man pressed, his eyes wide with the fantasy of it. "You must have felt powerful, turning the tables like that." Malcolm set his glass down. He looked at the young man, seeing not just ambition, but a hunger for a simplified story of revenge and victory. "Son," he said, his voice low and earnest, "if you measure power by the humiliation of someone else, you've already lost. The real power wasn't in owning the bank. It was in owning the moment to demand change, not just for myself, but for everyone who comes after. The tables shouldn't exist. The goal is to build a room where everyone has a seat and no one has to prove they belong at the table. The young man blinked, the simplistic revenge narrative dissolving into a more complex, challenging truth. He nodded slowly, the lesson beginning to sink in. Weeks turned into a month. The Granite National incident, as it had been quietly termed in corporate circles, became a required study in the training modules of not just the bank, but its competitors. Malcolm's quiet dismantling of Bradley Thornton had sent ripples through the entire industry, sparking audits of client service protocols citywide. One afternoon, Malcolm received a handwritten note on simple stationery. It was from Jana. "Mr. Greer, you asked me to help build something better. Yesterday, I was training a new teller. She asked me what the most important rule was. I told her it wasn't a rule. It's a question. Am I serving the person or am I serving my assumption? Thank you for the question." Gina, he smiled, a real, warm smile of deep satisfaction. This was the victory, not a humiliated manager, but an empowered teller. Not a public spectacle, but a private shift in mindset that would influence countless future interactions. The story of the well-dressed man and the check became a kind of local legend, often garbled in the retelling. But at its core, the truth remained. That dignity is priceless, that bias is a catastrophic liability, and that sometimes justice looks less like a thunderclap and more like a new plaque on a wall, a new question in a training, and the quiet, determined work of people choosing every day to be better than the system they inherited. Malcolm Greer's work was far from over, but the lesson had been written. Now it was everyone's turn to read it.